Hello, I'm Stu Heller. I'm continuing to moderate the Big Alef Speakers Forum. And tonight we have John Denker in Arvada and Arvada. Arvada. Two tries and I got it wrong both times. Arvada, Colorado. John grew up in rural area of Wyoming. His family did not involve itself in structured religion, but his father, who was naturalist and mystic, had an influence on him in later life that he never dreamed of as a kid. After high school, John got a PhD in range ecology, which led to a 30-year career in the Department of Interior. Over time, his study of nature revealed ontological mysteries that science seemed incapable of answering. John also received a master's degree in theology focused on Jewish Kabbalah from the Alef School of Theology at the University of Denver, and is an ordained minister in the United Methodist Church. He's been a member of Beit Alef for about 7 years. John has written 2 books on science and spirituality. The latest, called The Quantum God, can be found on Amazon.com or at Barnes & Noble, along with another book he wrote, Why Science Proves God. He also did an hour-long video podcast last fall, which can be seen via a Google search of intentions, and a man named Byron Delaire, Delear, which he appears in episode 10. And he can always be found at the Quantum God page on Facebook. And I'm going to let John take you deeper into all of this. John, thanks for educating us.
Okay. Years ago, I went to a conference where a woman by the name of Diana Butler Bass was speaking. She's an Episcopal priest and a PhD historian. She spoke of the new Enlightenment we are currently going through, the new worldview being driven by modern physical theory. According to her, every 500 years, we go through a change in worldview. And thus, what was going on 500 years ago? The Enlightenment, Columbus sailing the ocean blue, the Protestant Reformation, the Renaissance, Copernicus, Galileo, and Kepler telling us that we had the relationship between the sun and the earth backward. So where are we going now? We're going into what is called a quantum worldview, where everything is one. Oneness that consists of both mind and body that emerge from an unknown, unified, whatever that is. If you have gone to many of Rabbi Olivier's classes, you will have heard him say that everything is God. Everything is a manifestation of the unknown. In some of his Shabbat services, he has stated while looking out at the congregation, I am me, looking out at you, but someday I will be you, looking at me. This is because there's really only one mind. At the turn of the century, in the year 2000, the editor of Time magazine went on Meet the Press and stated that Time's person of the century was Albert Einstein. As you know, Time magazine does a person of the year. every year, but in 2000, they did a person of the century. The moderator looked rather puzzled as to why the person of the century wasn't Churchill or Eisenhower or some great political figure. The editor answered by stating, everyone will know in about 50 years. Why 50 years? Because changes in worldview take hundreds of years to sink down to the pedestrian or street level. The sailors that sailed with Columbus were afraid of falling off the earth. But academics had known for centuries that the world, in fact, was a sphere. Modern physical theory points to there being one being, and that is the universe. And that one universe is conscious. It's called Panpsychism, by the way. And thus, as the rabbi points out, there is that which can't be defined, ensconced in all things, and manifest in all things, and transcends all things. It can only be described in negation, as Moses Maimonides points out. For example, the unknown eternal is not love, although that which we think of as love is in the mix. It is not that or anything else. It is everything, whatever that is or not. It's made kind of strange. Well, let's go on to something that's kind of strange too. Sheridan, Wyoming. It's a weird place. I was born and for the most part raised in Sheridan. Sheridan is located near and between two of the worst defeats of European Americans in the Indian Wars, the Battle of the Little Bighorn and Fetterman's Massacre. However, it was the English cattle barons that would pacify and settle the area. One of the most prominent was a man by the name of Oliver Henry Wallop, the 7th Earl of Portsmouth, who would start the Canyon Ranch outside Sheridan. His great-grandson is George Herbert, the current lord of the manor at Downton Abbey, which his real name is Highclere Castle. You can show the Queen Elizabeth now.
Right, I'm gonna try my luck at screen sharing.
Anyway, in 1984, after the Falkland Islands War, Queen Elizabeth came to the US to knight Ronald Reagan for his help in that war. But after that, she came to Sheridan to visit her godson, Paul Wallop, and her good friend, US Senator Malcolm Wallop, whose brother-in-law was her racing manager. People of a certain age also remember something else, Jim Crow. And in Sheridan, ironically, it was the Crow tribe that was excluded. The Crow tribe is about 30 miles north of Sheridan. There were signs on the doors and the windows of mostly bars and restaurants, no dogs or Indians allowed. There's another irony here. While the Crows were excluded from many of the downtown businesses when they were in town, everyone was excluded from the businesses when the Queen and her entourage decided to shop. The Crows suffered, of course, like many oppressed people, from poverty. However, every summer, the town celebrated All-American Indian Days. And the public pool that my best friend and I lived at was given to the tribes. In the winter, we lived at the YO Theater, but in the summer, it was at the pool. At that point in time, whites were not allowed. It seemed like a key to life was separation and hierarchy, everyone knowing their place. Separation and difference formed our being. This, of course, is a delusion. All is the same transcendent essence. Flesh is nothing more than the infinite nothing, or Einstoff. If one ever studies the construct of an atom, one finds that only 1/1,000,000th of a billionth of an atom is made up of anything, and that anything is just light. An atom's essence is nothing. However, the mind of nature and man has constructed a whole diverse ecology from nothing. But only in humanity is hierarchy, because only in man is there ego. Thus, illogically, some nothing is worth more than other nothing, when in reality, it is one whole lot of nothing. Now I can show my dad's picture. We'll go ahead and put that up now. My dad and his two brothers spent World War II in Europe, where they experienced their share of death. My Aunt Lillian, who just passed in December, spent 15 years from 1945 to 1959 in Germany. She never found any family there. I did what she could not. I found them. In 2015, I went to Auschwitz with Beit Alef. Their names were listed amongst the millions at a small branch at Yad Vashem. We knew what had probably happened, but it still was a little bit of a jolt to see the names. Thus, Dad's view of humanity wasn't good. His synagogue, for what it's worth, was the mountains, lakes, and streams where he could get away and experience the divinity of nature. His way of meditating was gazing into a mountain sunrise where he would lose himself. He had been schooled well by his Orthodox mother in Torah and the mysticism she thought that it taught. I learned at a very early age that God was life and mind, and nature was God's Torah, his letters incarnate in all things created. But God's spirit could especially be seen in the wild, in those things living. You can now show my mother's picture. By the way, when you see the picture of my mother, she's in this is a play she was in college, so there's nothing wrong with her. She's just playing a part. But I love this picture. To be honest, some aspects of mysticism that my dad studied until the day he passed, I thought were weird. I was a science guy. My mother, on the other hand, was a nominal Methodist. Nominal means she could never be found within the shadow of the church. Once she tried to make peace with the local Methodist Church, but things did not end well. Nonetheless, her being a Methodist had a great influence on my life. In her eulogy, I told the story of Sarah and Isaac. Isaac means God's laugh. And boy, my mother could laugh. When I was in high school, long before the Queen ever visited, I would meet Robert Kennedy at a campaign stop. Believe it or not, I found myself standing between him and Tino Roncalio. Now, Tino Roncalio, you probably don't know, but his predecessor, or let's put it this way, his successor is a woman by the name of Liz Cheney, who of course was the daughter of Dick Cheney and has currently made a lot of noise in Congress lately. Anyway, I was standing between Robert Kennedy at the door of his limo. He had his hands on the back of the window like this, and he was about ready to get in. And so I was to his right, and to my left was Tino Roncalio. I looked at him and he at me. He in wonder of what I was doing there. I was in awe. And I don't recall a word being said. He was a flawed man in many ways, but no one ever held the ideals of a generation the way he did. And in a few weeks later, he was gone to history, and I would move to Denver. Eden was lost. I found Denver disorienting. Living in the suburbs, there's no core, no nucleus, just nothing. Life seemed to have little meaning. However, in a couple of years, I would graduate from high school, get spared from the Vietnam draft by the only lottery I ever won. But back in Sheridan, my best friend wasn't so lucky. and he would never come back. According to the Kabbalists and Albert Einstein, the world we see is a delusion, a mental construct. I was taught that hell is in the mind of the beholder. This is how thus, how could hell not be real for someone in war? Prior to this, I had enrolled at Colorado State University, where I would eventually get my PhD in range ecology. Concerning which, the first question I usually get is, what is range? However, the study of ecology in the West is a study of nature's life cycles, from the diversity of life to death and back again. Therefore, it is ironic that the early part of my career, that included fighting fires and gathering wild horses, was tainted by death. I still picture in my mind acres of snow covered by bloated corpses of starved deer, leaving no room to walk that wasn't rotting flesh. The leg snapped off a young wild colt by his panicked mother, who knocked herself out, charging a gate I had just closed in a horse trap. A melted radio I gave to a widow of a firefighter and colleague, so she would have something of his that was with him when he left this earth. Just when I was enjoying adventure, the nothingness of death would manifest itself, and the terrible hopelessness that we all feel at these times would set in. That's why I believe I looked for hope in the mystery that seemed to govern the wild. Looking for a benevolent reason, I suppose. So what is range? It is uncultivated lands west of the 100th meridian. The 100th meridian runs down through the middle of North Dakota, South Dakota, Nebraska, Kansas, and down through Texas. This is where the West starts in a pronounced change in climate and ecology. It is dry in the West until one comes to the Pacific Ocean. Ecosystems change from east to west. In the East, ecosystems are stabilized by a climax community. And in the West, the life cycle of the ecosystems are kept in turmoil by fire. The lifeblood of an ecosystem is the mineral cycle. In the East, things rot to return nutrients to the earth. In the West, things burn. Thus, fire brings nutrients for new life, as well as maintaining the health by killing diseases and insect infestations caused by mountain pine beetle. European man through the centuries has seen fire as an enemy, understandably. I almost lost my life and the life of my crew on the Cougar Creek fire in '73. And I lost colleagues on the Battlement Mesa fire and Storm King fires in '76 and '94. However, fires are an ecological necessity, and they are nature's will. At least that's what I told a group in Northern California in 2019, the spring after the campfires that had destroyed the town of Paradise and killed 86. Kenya Hiratson, let God's will be so. The longer a fire delayed, the more fury that it will exercise. Although my words at the time rang empty. You can show my picture now. Now for the mystical part of my story. In the early part of my career, I spent a lot of time with horses, either gathering wild horses or spending long hours on the back of a horse in remote country. In the 1970s, and for the most part the 80s, we had no GPSs, cell phones, or ATVs. A lot of seasoned employees, it seemed, would always volunteer to hike rather than ride a horse. They'd look at that big animal and say, forget it, I'll walk. However, the country was big and the horse wasn't just transportation, it was a lifeline. Most of the remote country, especially in the wilderness areas, was heavily timbered and very easy to get turned around in. When I first started for the Forest Service, I lived in a cabin in the forest. I'd get up in the morning, go gather my horse with some rolled oats, saddle him up, load him in the back of my pickup that had a stock rack, and I drove to that part of the forest I had to patrol or do studies in. I'd unload the horse, then I would proceed to get lost in miles of rough country. It's very easy to get turned around in timber. However, I would let loose on the reins. My horse would pick up his ears, go into a trot, and if I kept my faith, or even if I didn't keep my faith, he would magically return me to my truck. And so that's one of the things I always had to tell the seasonals. You get turned around, you just let the horse go. The horse, being a creature of nature, had a mental connection to the universe that I didn't have. My dad had told me life and mind are spirits. Animals have life and mind, but no ego. The song by the group America, "A Horse with No Name," explains it. And ironically, the song came out when I was busy getting lost on a horse with no name. So the name of my horse was Horse. However, my real passion was in designing studies to monitor ecosystems and rare and endangered plant species. In 1969, NEPA had been passed, which required us to conduct inventories and other studies in accordance with ecosystems principles. Thus, I headed a team to develop an inventory system based on these principles and automate the compilation and analysis using computers, which were the size of a two-car garage at the time. Now we can get more computing power than that on the back of a watch. However, first we had to develop matrices, the mapping, the algorithms, the software, the statistics, standards for evaluation, alternate studies to check the inventory studies, etc., and hire a crew to spend several seasons collecting data. By the time my career was over, I spent close to 30 years designing and collecting data for different projects. In the meantime, I would get married, and by the early 80s, my children would start school. My wife and I decided that a moral education for the children was important. However, there was another reason I wanted to go to church. The more I studied nature, the more it seemed to me there was a profound mystery. There's more than a horse I didn't understand. It was nature itself that was smarter than me. To be honest, the small Methodist church we went to didn't provide any answers. But I stuck it out because of friendship, and in a decade or so, a pathway opened up. Why the Methodist Church? Well, first, there were no synagogues where I lived, and my mother had been a Methodist. Of course, she was a nominal Methodist, so I had no idea what the Methodists believed in, except that they were Christians, and that was a problem. In time, I would find that the church was non-doctrinal, and one is given a very wide latitude to develop their own theology. In short, one wasn't required to hate Jews, which would have been very inconvenient for me. However, what was it that I understood about an ecosystem that was mystical? First, let me explain an anthill. Ants, you probably know, have specialized functions: warehouse workers, nurses, soldiers, hunter-gatherers, etc. There are approximately 340,000 ants in an average anthill, with approximately 86 billion neurons. The cortex of the human brain has about 86 billion neurons. The difference is that ants are each separate beings. Nonetheless, they function as one intellectual and emotional unit. What is the unifying force? An ecosystem is even much more complex, with a multitude of species and abiotic elements. They are exponentially smarter than people. Stephen Jay Gould, a Jew, who was an evolutionary theorist at Harvard, he's passed now, but he believed in a theory called punctuated equilibrium, whose basic principle is that species evolve to fill all ecological niches. This is referred to as the full house theory, as opposed to the survival of the fittest theory of neo-Darwinism. Gould believed that species evolution was directed, and of course, in correlation with other species, evolved the ecosystem. And he believed that the mutations necessary for this evolution start before the habitat changes that require it. The problem with neo-Darwinism is that for the universe to go from a singularity to the random evolution of intelligent life in the span of only 14 billion years has infinite odds against its happening. It is like an ecosystem has an invisible orchestra conductor directing its evolution. By the way, Gould never mentions a God. But in the white between the lines of his writing, there is an implication of intention. This has caused his nemesis, neo-Darwinist Richard Dawkins, to go berserk. By the way, there's another evolutionary theorist by the name of Brian Schwimm, who's a mathematics professor in San Francisco. He produced a movie titled The Journey of the Universe. And in that, he shows how quantum particles are self-organizing. In 1991, at a church conference at CSU, I decided to go into the ministry. The place that brought me to ecology would bring me to theology. This would require a move to Denver. How I would pull that off, I didn't know. Later that day, I drove to my parents' house in Denver to pick up Celeste and the kids to go back across the mountains to Craig. Celeste was receiving medical treatments in Denver for a serious condition that she had. She met me at the door to tell me her doctor had told her she would have to move to Denver. She could no longer continue her medical treatments and live on the Western Slope. The medical news wasn't good, but I guess the universe wanted me in Denver. The Alef School of Theology at Denver University has a couple of personalities. One is as a graduate school for theology, philosophy, and psychology, which attracts students from a variety of faith traditions. At the time, the senior rabbi of the largest synagogue in Denver, the Rabbi Stephen Foster, was an Alef grad. The last thing I did in seminary was prepare a service for him. And now for Alef's second personality. Alef is a seminary for Methodist and Anglican clergy, although it has a very good Jewish studies unit as well, of which I took great advantage of. I had two epiphanies at Alef. One was in a class titled The Theology of Pastoral Counseling with Professor Joretta Marshall. The main lesson there was that life is messy, but that wasn't the epiphany. I had to do a paper on the self. So self, I said, let's look you up in the APA Dictionary of Psychology. And there it was in the first paragraph. My dad could have written this. The self is the I am, which I put together with Exodus 3:14, where God told Moses to call him I am. This means the mind is God, or at least that is what I heard it saying. This was already way off from the theology of most Christian clergy who believe in a God that has nothing to do with nature and lives in heaven. However, I didn't care what they believed. I wanted to know what was real. You can show the diagram of the tense throat now. My second epiphany came in Seth Ward's Kabbalah class. I remember when Dr. Ward completed the description of the tense throat of the tree of life. It hit me over the head like a 2x4. These may be ancient Hebrew terms, but they are real. A few years earlier, a 90-something professor by the name of Harvey Potthoff gave me a book on the philosophy of modern physical theory. The book is called Religion in an Age of Science by Ian Barber, a theoretical physicist and a theologian. A couple years later, this would be used as a textbook. However, I began a study of Einstein to Hawking to Penrose to Davies to Weinberg to Stuart Kauffman and more theoretical physicists than I could remember for the purpose of my theological thesis. And what Dr. Ward had just outlined in my mind fit modern physical theory. What I'm about to go into, by the way, is my theology, not yours. However, we can learn from sharing. There's no crying in baseball, and there's no wrong in theology. There's only what you believe, and no one else gets a vote on that. Science itself is a belief system based on two principles, metaphysical realism and epistemological realism. Einstein did away with epistemological realism. By the way, that simply means that what we see out here is what is real. It's not. Einstein said, if you think what you see outside yourself is real, get yourself a pencil and a piece of paper and draw yourself a four-dimensional figure. You can't do it because your mind can only see reality in 3 dimensions. Now, metaphysical realism, too, is under heavy assault. And metaphysical realism is the idea that there's something out there separate from your mind at all. For example, Steven Weinberg, who was at the University of Texas, he was also the Nobel Prize winner for the electroweak theory and particle physics. As concerns dark matter, he stated that dark matter wasn't matter at all, but a cosmological constant. And if so, and he thought it was, then we have more to do with our own creation than what he would like to think. However, he did think dark matter was a cosmological constant. And of course, the reason for that, the cosmological constant heavily implies intention. However, each one needs to have a rock or a source of authority that informs them as to the nature of reality. For example, Christian fundamentalists believe in a superficial reading of the Christian Bible. It is the ultimate truth in both science and history. It is their rock. On the other hand, there was a theologian, Paul Tillich, who wished there was no history in the Bible at all, Jewish or Christian. He thought that arguments over history took away from the spiritual truth of the myth. His walk was a well-reasoned philosophy going from Martin Buber to Soren Kierkegaard to Friedrich Nietzsche and others such as Spinoza. Now, what I believe. Let's look at the Big Bang Theory. The Big Bang Theory is based on Einstein's theory of general relativity. The Big Bang Theory can't be fully understood by the way we see reality, but one can use the model of an inflating balloon to get some understanding. Supposedly, the universe started out as a mathematical point or a singularity with no dimensions. The balloon inflated from that center point at a very rapid rate till gravity kicked in about 300,000 years out to slow the inflation. This caused energy and matter to form around a vacuous unknown. Today, the universe continues to expand at an exponentially increasing rate. Understand time, space, energy, and matter only exist on the skin of the balloon. Thus, this question, what is the universe expanding into? Whatever it is, we can't know, but it is referred to as the zero-point field, the essence of which is referred to as vacuum energy. The 0-point field can also be referred to as the infinite nothing. However, I like to think of it as Einstoff. According to Moses Cordovera, Einstoff is thought, and Kabbalah is the infinite nothing that surrounds and transcends the tree of life, similar to how vacuum energy surrounds and transcends the universe. The study of consciousness, as opposed to neuroscience, which is a separate science, took a serious turn in the 1960s. Currently, institutions such as Princeton, the University of Arizona, and the University of Rochester have very strong research programs. Apollo 15 astronaut Edgar Mitchell, a physicist, also started the Institute of Noetic Science in Berkeley, California. Most fascinating is Princeton's Consciousness Project. They measure change in the ambient Earth vibrations in correlation with major global events. On September 10, 2001, these vibrations spiked. Now everybody knows what happened on September 11th of that year. The Earth knew something was going to happen. However, more used to us are the contemplative exercises such as meditation that put brainwaves in an alpha state of about 8 hertz. The resonant vibration of the Earth is 7.83 or about 8 hertz. The Om sound that we always say in our meditations, show Om, or chant, produces a sound of 432 hertz. The natural frequency of the universe is said to be 432 hertz. By the way, there's a good book on this by a guy by the name of Bill Douglas, who wrote a book called The Gospel of Science, in which he talks about the meditative practices or contemplative practices. But he's expert in Tai Chi, but still it's good for yoga or meditation as well. The lesson here is that bonding with the energy of the world brings wholeness and healing. An overarching idea is that love is our ontological feeling of oneness with other people, entities, and the universe itself. Thus, performing a mitzvah in accordance with our gifts bursts, if not joy, at least satisfaction. Circling back, which is a popular expression these days, the thought that is the essence of Einstoff flows from the Keter, the crown at the top of the Kabbalistic tree of life. You might put that diagram back up here. From there it flows right to the Chokmah, the divine father or wisdom. Here it concentrates into a point, a singularity that shoots horizontally across the tree, rapidly inflates to form a womb and Bina. And you can see the 3 top ones there, Keter, Chokmah, and Bina. Bina is the divine mother or divine womb. She's also considered to be understanding. In Seth Ward's class, I thought this sounded an awful lot like the Big Bang. And it wasn't just me. In some of our classes, Rabbi Olivier is taught from what's called the Zohar. Daniel Matt has written, or edited, I should say, probably the epitome of Zohar. There's about 12 volumes of this size. That provided a lot of birthday presents for me. Anyway, but Daniel Matt wrote a book, which is very good on this too. It's called God and the Big Bang. And basically it's Kabbalah and the Big Bang. And he has a very strong analogy there. From Bina is born the lower 7th Sphirot of the tree of life, that is creation. Gravity providing the contractions for energy and matter to be born. This is where the new physics comes to light in Kabbalah. What distinguishes the new from the old Newtonian physics? Newtonian physics is about quantum particles acting in accordance with natural law or algorithms. Matter is the primary principle of reality. The world is made up of separate particles and separate entities. In the new physics, the primary principle of reality is mind. Mind or thought is the antecedent to all things created. It is mind that makes up natural law, but it can also act randomly. And with mind, there is subjective random or objective randomness. The universe doesn't act like a computer where everything acts in accordance with algorithms. In the new physics, the universe can act outside its algorithms or natural law and change them. In other words, the universe acts like a human mind. Dr. Ward taught the ten Sefirot a little different than what is taught at Beit Aleph. He taught that there was a male side, the Sefirot on the right side, referred to as Metatron, the angel of the demiurge. And on the female side is Elohim, the Sefirot on the left side. The male side is the observer. It is characterized by spirit, mind, life, and love, that which is change/motion. Rabbi Olivier has talked many times how God isn't really God. God is a verb. God is actually Goding, and that's the change in motion. I call the male side the uncertainty or mystery side because it not only represents an eternity outside time and space, but the infinity of time and space. And it represents randomness. Einstein discovered that matter is made up of energy, E equals mc squared. However, it always bothered him that he couldn't predict when light waves would collapse to form matter and when they would not. It was random. In the 1960s, John Wheeler at Princeton found that an electron would appear as a particle or as a wave function, depending on how one desires to observe and or measure it. This is called the observer effect. The female side is the observed. It is formed, designed, and limitation. In short, it is natural law. It forms the energy and force from the male side into created entities that appear separate but are not. Einstein stated that the universe is really one being. The delusion is that there are separate beings. Mathematics or natural law is a mental construct, and according to Einstein, the primary principle of reality. While math relates to observed qualities of nature, some math may very well relate to mental characteristics in our world. Bertrand Rymian believed that if math correlated to things that are real, it could be observed, then it could also describe things that could not be observed. The governing principle of the female side is what's known as the strong anthropic principle, that states that the universe had to unfold in a manner in which intelligent life would evolve. This circles back to Stephen Jay Gould's theory of evolution. The significance of the center column is the joining of Tiferet, Yesod, and Shekinah. This is the joining of male and female, is a complementary union. Niels Bohr, a contemporary of Einstein, theorized that such a union is a paradox. He called wave-particle duality or complementarity. And that means that before an entity is actually observed, it exists both as a particle and as a wave. Actually, there's a story about this called Schrodinger's cat. And what it is a piece of uranium is put in a box with a cat with a bottle of poison. Now, if the uranium undergoes atomic radiation or atomic degradation, it'll send off a particle, and the particle will break the bottle of poison, and the cat will die. But the story is that the cat is neither alive or dead until you can actually open the box and observe what the cat's state is. And that's kind of the same thing with wave-particle duality. Things exist as either particles or waves until we actually observe what it is. And then that settles the paradox. Niels Bohr, a contemporary of Einstein, theorized that such a unit's paradox that he called complementarity. The paradox is resolved upon the observation of the entity. Again, this goes back to John Wheeler's experiments on the electrons, where it occurs either as a particle or as a wave, depending on how we decide to observe it. This paradox is easier to understand in Kabbalistic language, where reality exists at the same time, both as particles of creation, Shekinah, and as a unity of spirit or energy, Tiferet. In both Kabbalah and Bohr's thoughts, individualism of particles and the unity of energy are the manifestations of a deeper unknown reality. Thus, I would graduate as a Jewish Kabbalist, and I would be ordained a United Methodist minister with all the pomp and circumstance of the Middle Ages. As Joretta Marshall would say, life is messy. And that's all I have. So if you have any questions, now's the time.
So John, how did you, this is Kate, yeah. How did you discover Beit Alef and get back to your Jewish roots?
I served on the board of the United Religions Initiative I was on the board and an officer of the United Religions Initiative. And I served with Margie Coles, who was also an officer.
Oh, yeah, okay.
United Religions Initiative. And so I actually stayed at her house in a meeting of Beit Alef. She had a kind of a small party for him one night. And so I met some of the members at that time. And then I found out from her that the rabbi wanted to start reaching out more with this Torah Studies.
Mm-hmm.
And he wanted to get people to come in off Skype. And as it turns out, I was the only one that did it. But I did. And of course, his Torah studies are very interesting. And I found out that his theology was pretty much my theology. I just about could complete his sentences. And that's basically, I mean, and it was so refreshing too, because my theology was so much different from any other clergy in the Methodist Church. It was really refreshing to go to an institution that held the same beliefs I did. And so that was really what it was about. So, so I just started going and I kept on. Mm-hmm. Then I retired from the ministry in 2015, although I'll be ordained until the day I die, but I'm no longer active. But still, I then went ahead and became a member. I didn't join before that because I didn't know what the bishop would do if I did, to be quite honest. I knew there was an Episcopal priest in Seattle that joined a mosque.
Yes, that was Ann Holmes Redding. Yeah, she and Jamal and I wrote a book together. Yeah, I was really involved at that time while Anne was suffering from the effects of what she did. Yeah.
And she got defrocked, so I said, maybe I better not join until I'm actually tired.
No dual citizenship, huh?
No. You know, the Methodist bishops can be pretty liberal on some things. They're pretty parochial though, so you got to be
Yeah.
careful. So
Same with the Episcopal Church, you know, I think it was a shock to Anne, certainly, and I was surprised also. But the bishop, you know, that caused her those problems was in Rhode Island, I think. That was,
yeah.
and it was also at a time when there was a lot of struggle within the Episcopal Church about how liberal it was going to be, because there was a lot of activism from Africa.
Yeah.
They wanted a much more traditional kind of church. Thank you very much. And that bishop in Rhode Island, for whatever reason, she was kind of caught in some of that traditional and conservative activism.
Yeah.
And this was not the right time for Anne to have declared that she was also submissive to the will of God.
Yeah. The Methodist Church right now is pretty much going through a lot of the same turmoil. A lot because the church is growing really fast in Africa. In fact, there's probably about as many United Methodists in Africa now as there are in the United States. And my bishop now is Karen Oliveto, who is the first lesbian bishop.
Whoa!
The first gay bishop, and she's married to her wife, and so that may cause a split in the church. We don't know what's going on right now,
Right.
But the problem is that the African side of the church is so conservative.
Yes, exactly.
Just been for the U.S. church, it would have allowed gay ordination already, but the African part won't go along with that. So
no, absolutely not. And that's what Anne got caught up in. Exactly that.
Yeah. I mean, the Methodist Church is still the second largest Protestant. I think it's the largest, to be honest with you, because the Baptists do a lot of funny things with their counting. But anyway, well, the problem is once you become a Southern Baptist, you're not allowed to ever quit. You're considered.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
I knew a minister one day he was probably about 80 and his wife was about 80. And she had quit the Southern Baptists about 60 years before that, but they still considered her a member.
Yeah, yeah.
So I think probably the Methodist still probably is the largest because they do allow people to quit. So
that's kind of Catholic too, you know.
Yeah.
Like I left the Catholic Church, but as far as they're concerned, I still have that mark of that indelible mark of baptism on my soul.
Yeah.
I remember when one time when we were in Israel with Rabbi Ted, we ended up, it was an interfaith trip. And so Jamal was there, the Muslim, and Don, the Christian, and Ted, the rabbi, and anybody. We were at the Sea of Galilee, and anybody who wanted to, learn to do the ablutions of the Muslims or to be baptized, they could go to Don's line, and I of course went to Ted's line, and I'm standing there in the sea. And splashing water onto myself and sort of going rub, trying to get rid of that indelible mark of the Christian baptism. But no, as far as the church is concerned, I'm a member to death. But as far as I'm concerned, I'm a Jew to my death.
Yeah. It's what you think that's important, but anyway. Actually, the Methodist Church is the only major denomination in the United States where we work for the bishop. We don't work for the local church. It's by bishop's appointment. Even the Episcopalians serve by call. They're called by the
They do,
church.
yeah, exactly.
But we serve under bishop appointment, and that's who we work for as the bishop.
Wow.
But the Catholics are the only other denomination that does that.
Yeah, yeah. Hmm.
So
Yeah.
anyway, yeah, it was refreshing to go to Beit Aleph and actually hear my thoughts spoken back to me. So that's what happened. Plus the fact that at the time I was really ticked off at some of the theological stances the church was taking when it came to it came to the nature of nature. I'll just put it that way.
The nature of what?
The nature of nature. They were making
Oh,
it
yeah.
very clear that God did not exist in nature, and any such talk would not be allowed. Actually, they couldn't say that, but they made it very clear that God is not in nature. And I just,
Is that right?
being a pantheist and a natural theologian, that just didn't work real well with me.
I guess not, yeah.
I was pretty ticked off about the whole thing. So
Yeah, that's pretty weird. But
yeah. But
Hmm.
anyway,
Do we have questions from anybody else? John, I was wondering, you said that, if I understood you, and correct me if I'm wrong, that the universe was one being.
yeah, that was Einstein's general theory of relativity. He came out of that with the idea that the universe was really only one being. And basically where it comes from is the electromagnetic field, which is where matter and energy in the physical world comes from. It's just one field. It's the smallest unit of the electromagnetic field is the physical universe. And so it is just one, technically it is just one being. And like I said, that came out in 1916, which most people still don't know, and maybe another 50 years it'll soak down to the pedestrian street level. But Einstein said a lot of things that were very revolutionary that still haven't really soaked down to the street level.
yeah.
But actually what Einstein was, he was a little Jewish mystic.
Yes,
And
exactly.
I always thought it kind of funny that all of modern physical theory and science today is based on the ideas of a little Jewish mystic. He was asked one time where he got his thoughts. Actually, Steven Weinberg writes about this too in his book. And he said there are some scientists that are sages and some scientists that are prophets. Sages are those scientists that build on past knowledge. Prophets have ideas that we have absolutely no idea where they came with them, where their ideas came from. They just come out of thin air. Well, Einstein in his book, Ideas and Opinions, said his ideas came from when he became one with the mind of the universe. So he basically confirms what Weinberg had said about him, that he was a prophet, but that's how he got his ideas.
Well, if we look at and maybe I'm just being too superficial, but if we look at the universe as one being, then am I? What are you? What are generations of people that come and go? The rabbi talks about us being like waves in the ocean.
Yeah.
And they hit the shore and they just kind of dissolve back into the
And
ocean.
because they go back into the ocean. But that's why it's called non-dualism. He doesn't call it monism. He calls it non-dualism. And the reason for that is that there is that illusion of separation that is there. So that we, at least for, it was always my view that we experience life for God. And so we do have that illusion of separation, that we can live our lives so we can experience life for God. A lot of people used to ask the question, why do we need God? To me, it was always the other way around. Why does God need us? And God needs us to experience life. And so we do live that illusion. And for us, it's very real. But when you realize that you're really a part, just a small part of the whole, and that life is eternal, then I think you can live a much more satisfactory life. Because like I said, when you perform the mitzvah, that's really has a meaning to it. That's really when you become one with your neighbor. And that gives you a feeling of joy. But
All right. Well, John, thank you very much for very thought-provoking presentation. It's clear that you delved into this in dimensions that I can't even dream of. I'm glad you showed me some of them. I'm going to stop the recording. I'm going to thank you for putting all your efforts and work and experience into this, but I'm going to leave the program open so that those of you who want to continue visiting or asking John questions can do that. So let's see here. Oh, I wanted to tell you that in 2 weeks, we are going to have Linda Moldauer, who's going to talk to us about something quite different, computer dating. She has recently been through, let's say, a learning experience with computer dating, and she's going to share that with us. So please join us in 2 weeks, and thank you so much for joining us tonight.
everybody knows you're getting married on Friday, right?
I don't know if they do. It's true. I am getting married in 2 nights.
Wow.
So,
Wow.
yeah. Wow. So
Wow.
what am I doing fiddling around with this video stuff?
Well, as my dear departed husband